Okay, so you want to know more than just how organizations spot risks. You want to know how they actually tackle those risks.
Yeah, you want to move past the theory and get into the nitty-gritty of making risk management happen.
You bet. And thankfully, you've brought us some really interesting material for this deep dive, some different perspectives on how organizations actually do this.
It's a crucial step, right? Once those risks are identified, what happens next?
Exactly. And your sources are all about that next stage. How do organizations decide what to do? How do they make sure it actually works?
The core ideas around risk treatment and control, that's our focus this time.
Pulling wisdom from ISO 31000, the UK Orange Book, and even the SECO ERM frameworks. That's a good mix.
Yeah, we're trying to paint a really clear picture of that whole journey from, oh, there's a risk to we're actively managing it.
Perfect. So let's start with the basics. We've got our risks laid out, analyzed, prioritized. Now what?
Now comes the action risk treatment. This is where we decide what we're going to do about those risks.
It's about making choices, taking control.
ISO 31000 puts it very simply. The whole point is to select and apply options for dealing with risk.
Okay, that sounds straightforward enough. But I'm curious, the Orange Book seems to add another dimension to this.
Oh, definitely.
It talks about this balance between the benefits of achieving objectives and the costs, the effort, even potential downsides of our choices.
Right. It's not just a cold, hard calculation.
So it's not just about, is this the most efficient way to neutralize the risk? There's more to it.
The Orange Book wants us to think more broadly. It pushes us to consider things like our responsibilities, our commitments to others, the views of our stakeholders.
It's a much more holistic perspective, taking in the bigger picture.
Exactly. So while ISO might tell you what to do, the Orange Book makes you think about why and how you do it.
Makes sense. And then, of course, we have the COSO ERM models. How do they fit into this picture of moving from identifying risks to taking action?
Well, COSO breaks this down into key stages. The 2004 model had this idea of risk response. You've got your choices, avoid the risk, accept it, reduce it, share it.
Okay, I remember those classic risk responses.
But then, crucially, it emphasized control activities.
The actual doing part.
This is where you put those policies and procedures in place to make your chosen response happen.
So you can't just say, we're going to reduce this risk. You have to have a plan for how you're going to reduce it.
The later 2017 COSO ERM framework builds on this, talks about implementing risk responses. It's all about taking concrete steps, not just deciding in theory what you'll do.
Makes sense. You can't just have a risk management plan sitting on a shelf somewhere. It has to be put into action.
Exactly. And of course, we can't treat every risk with the same intensity.
Right. We'd be drowning in risk management if we tried to tackle everything equally.
You need to prioritize. And that's where different methods come in. You look at things like likelihood, impact, urgency, severity. You figure out what needs your attention first.
Because let's face it, completely eliminating every single threat, seizing every opportunity.
It's just not realistic.
It's not feasible, it's not cost effective, and frankly, our initial assessment of a risk might not even be perfect.
We might overestimate or underestimate certain things.
Right, and that could lead to us putting huge effort into something that's actually quite minor.
Or missing something important because it's hiding in the noise.
Okay, so we've decided on our treatment, we've put some controls in place. Are we done?
Oh, not even close.
Hmm.
This is where that critical feedback loop comes in.
The never-ending cycle of risk management.
You treat a risk, and then you have to reevaluate it. You see, did our actions actually work? Did they bring the risk down to an acceptable level?
Comparing it to our risk appetite, how much risk we're comfortable with.
Exactly. If the risk is still too high, we need to take further action. So it's this back and forth.
Treat, reanalyze, treat again if needed.
And sometimes, if we find that we just can't reduce a risk to where we want it to be,
maybe we have to rethink our original objectives.
maybe those objectives were too ambitious, given the risks involved.
That's a good point. Sometimes you have to adjust your goals to match the reality of the risks you face.
It's a dynamic process. The context changes, new risks emerge, controls might not work as well as we thought, even our risk appetite can shift over time.
It's this constant evolution, right? And that feedback loop is what keeps the whole risk management system running.
Spot on.
Yeah.
And that feedback is what feeds into monitoring and reviewing, which we'll get to later. For now, let's talk about how we actually do something about those risks.
Okay, let's talk controls. It's a word we hear all the time in risk management.
Controls are essential.
But what exactly are they?
ISO 31000 defines a control as any measure that maintains and/or modifies risk. That's pretty broad, right?
It is. So what kinds of things can be controls?
Well, they can be processes, policies, devices, practices, really anything that helps to manage risk. But, and this is important,
There's a but coming. I can sense it.
they don't always work as intended. You can have a control in place, but it might not be effective.
Ah, so just having a policy written down doesn't mean the risk is actually being controlled.
The example from your sources about the COVID-19 pandemic is perfect here. Collecting data on test results, issuing guidance on self-isolation.
Those things in themselves, they're not controls.
Right. They only become controls if people actually act on them. If there's no change in behavior, no change in process.
Then the risk isn't really being modified.
That's why it's so important to have what your source calls risk checks. Audits, tests, verification procedures. These are the things that tell you whether your controls are actually doing their job.
So it's not just about having controls, it's about making sure those controls are actually effective.
Right. It's about implementation, not just existence.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, when it comes to choosing our risk management strategies, cost is obviously a factor.
Absolutely. Resources are always limited.
So how do we weigh those costs against the potential benefits of mitigating a risk?
ISO 31000 talks about conducting a benefit analysis. We want to make sure that the effort we put into managing risks is proportionate to the potential harm those risks could cause.
So you don't want to spend $1 million to prevent a $1,000 problem.
Exactly. And the standard outlines a whole range of potential strategies.
Give me the rundown.
Well, you can avoid the risk altogether, stop doing the activity that creates the risk. That's usually a last resort, though.
Right. Sometimes you can't just stop doing something entirely.
Then there's transferring the risk, shifting the burden to someone else. Insurance is the classic example.
Sharing the risk through partnerships or outsourcing, that kind of thing.
Or you can treat the risk, take steps to reduce its likelihood or its impact. This is probably the most common approach.
And finally, you can tolerate the risk, accept it if it's within your risk appetite.
But with that one, you have to be careful. You don't want to be tolerating risks that are actually really serious just because you haven't properly assessed them.
Unknowingly accepting a huge risk, that's not good.
Now, your source also mentioned this 4Ts framework specifically for dealing with threats.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Terminate, transfer, treat, tolerate.
It's a good starting point, but it can be a bit simplistic. It doesn't always capture the nuances of really complex risks, especially those that are right on the edge of our risk appetite.
Like those ones that are hard to categorize as clearly high or low.
And the idea of just transferring a risk through insurance?
Yeah.
That's not always a complete solution.
You might be covered financially, but what about the reputational damage or the disruption to your operations?
And for opportunities, there's the take strategy, which is kind of a proactive form of tolerance.
Deliberately taking on a risk because the potential reward is worth it.
And then there are the 5 E's for opportunities. Explore, expand, exit, exploit, exist.
This one's often linked to the life cycle of a business.
But not all businesses or opportunities follow that neat, linear path. The 5 E's can be a bit too rigid in some cases.
So they're useful frameworks, but we shouldn't treat them as gospel.
Think of them as tools to help you think, not rules that you have to follow blindly.
Okay, good advice. Now, I noticed that your sources also talked about how organizations might have different risk management approaches depending on what they're dealing with. Projects, operations, strategic decisions.
Oh, absolutely. Risk management isn't one size fits all.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, with projects, you're often very focused on specific hazards and their immediate impact.
What could go wrong during this project, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Operational risk management is more about the day-to-day running of the business and those potential disruptions.
Keeping the lights on, so to speak.
And then at the strategic level, you're looking at the big picture, long-term trends, things that could fundamentally change the game.
And those strategic risks are often driven from the board level, right?
They are. It's about making sure that your risk management approach is appropriate for the level of decision-making involved.
Makes sense. Now, let's go back to controls for a minute. Our sources mention different types of controls.
There are a few ways to categorize them. One useful distinction is whether they aim to change the likelihood of a risk happening or the impact if it does happen.
So you can either try to prevent something from happening or minimize the damage if it does.
And this applies to both threats and opportunities.
Okay, so it's not just about preventing bad things, it's also about maximizing the chances of good things happening.
Precisely. And when we're talking about threats, we often talk about loss control.
What does that involve?
It's a combination of preventing losses from happening in the first place, limiting the damage if they do occur, and containing the costs associated with them.
So it's a three-pronged approach: prevention, damage limitation, and cost containment.
Exactly. And then there's the PCDD framework.
Preventative, corrective, directive, detective. I've heard of that one.
It used to be more prominent, but as your source points out, it's not as central in modern risk management thinking.
Okay, so it's not obsolete, but it's not the be-all and end-all either.
Right. But it's still useful to understand the different categories. So preventive controls are designed to stop the risk event from happening at all.
Like having strong security measures to prevent theft.
Corrective controls come into play after a risk event has occurred to minimize the damage and get things back on track.
Like a disaster recovery plan.
Directive controls are about guiding behavior, making sure people do things in a way that minimizes risk.
Standard operating procedures, that kind of thing.
But those rely heavily on people actually following the rules. And then detective controls, they're designed to spot when a risk event has happened.
Like a fire alarm going off.
Exactly.
So I can see how these categories relate to the 4Ts. PCD is basically giving us different ways to treat risks.
It is. But the source did mention that neither PCD nor the 4Ts are ideal for directly integrating into a risk matrix.
Why is that?
They're more like high-level frameworks. A more practical way to think about it, as the source suggested, is to distinguish between proactive and reactive controls.
Proactive being before the event, reactive being after.
Exactly. Proactive controls are things you do to prevent an event or guide behavior in advance.
And reactive controls are about responding to an event that has already happened.
This aligns well with ISO 31000's focus on addressing both the causes and the consequences of risks.
And then there's this idea of anticipatory controls.
Oh, those are interesting. They're like directive controls, but they're specifically aimed at long-term strategic risks.
So it's about preparing for potential future scenarios, not just managing the risks we're facing right now.
Exactly. It's about thinking ahead and building in resilience for the long term.
Okay, can we have some real-world examples of all this? Proactive versus reactive controls, anticipatory controls.
Sure. Let's say we're talking about fraud risk. A proactive control might be having a really thorough vetting process for new employees.
To make sure you're not hiring someone who's likely to commit fraud?
Or you can have very clear and consistently enforced penalties for fraudulent activity.
To deter people from even trying it.
Those are proactive. Now, a reactive control might be regularly reviewing supplier invoices for anything suspicious.
To catch fraud after it's happened, hopefully before it becomes a major problem.
You could also have a whistleblowing hotline for employees to report concerns.
So you're encouraging people to speak up if they see something fishy.
And you need a clear plan for what to do if fraud is discovered. How do you handle media inquiries? When do you involve law enforcement?
Those are all reactive measures. And what about anticipatory controls?
In the context of fraud, an anticipatory control might involve investing in technology that can detect patterns of fraudulent activity before it even happens.
Like using artificial intelligence to analyze transactions and flag anything that looks suspicious.
Or it could involve developing training programs that help employees to better understand and identify different types of fraud.
So you're building a more fraud-aware culture within the organization.
Exactly. It's about thinking ahead and preparing for the future.
Okay, all these examples really help to clarify the different types of controls. Now, we touched on the cost of implementing controls earlier, but what about the benefits? Those can be harder to quantify.
Oh, they definitely can. Calculating the costs is usually fairly straightforward.
Staff time, administrative overhead, the cost of the controls themselves, insurance premiums.
Those are all tangible expenses. But the benefits, they're often more about things that didn't happen.
How do you put a dollar value on a loss that you prevented?
And if you have multiple controls working together to manage a single risk,
how do you know which control is responsible for what portion of the benefit?
It can get very complicated. And then there's the whole sense of assurance that comes from having good risk management.
It's valuable, but how do you measure that?
As your source suggested, it often comes down to judgment and qualitative assessment rather than a purely quantitative calculation.
So it's not always about a clear ROI.
But our risk appetite definitely influences the costs.
If we have a low-risk appetite, meaning we're really not comfortable with potential negative outcomes,
we're likely to spend more on controls.
Because we're trying to reduce those risks as much as possible.
But that also means we have lower risk exposure overall. And when it comes to pursuing opportunities, There are also costs involved.
You have to invest to achieve those potential gains.
And it's important to recognize that there's a point of diminishing returns.
You mean at some point, adding more controls doesn't really reduce the risk much further?
Exactly. The goal isn't to eliminate all risk. It's to find the sweet spot where the benefits of control outweigh the costs.
Okay, so we've implemented our controls. How do we know if they're actually working? How do we measure their success?
Effectiveness isn't just about looking at the numbers. The design of the control itself is crucial.
A well-designed control is more likely to be effective from the get-go.
Right. But you also need to consider how easy it is to implement, how sustainable it is over time, how it affects the people and processes involved.
So it needs to be practical, not just theoretical.
And a good checklist for evaluating effectiveness should cover a few key areas.
Like what?
Well, you want to look at the design, obviously, but also how well it's been implemented, how consistently it's being maintained, its impact on both the likelihood and the consequences of the risk, and of course the costs.
Sounds comprehensive. Now, I know our sources mentioned some interesting models for thinking about control effectiveness. Things like the hierarchy of controls and the Swiss cheese model. Can you explain those a bit?
Sure, the hierarchy of controls is a framework from health and safety. It basically ranks different types of controls based on how effective they are.
So what's at the top of the hierarchy?
Elimination, completely removing the hazard.
If you can get rid of the risk altogether, that's the best solution.
Next is substitution, replacing something hazardous with something less hazardous.
Like using a less toxic chemical in a manufacturing process.
Then you have engineering controls, which are changes to the work environment to reduce exposure to the hazard.
Like installing safety guards on machinery.
Administrative controls are things like procedures, training, work practices.
And finally, at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have PPE, personal protective equipment.
That's the least effective because it relies on individuals to consistently use it properly.
Makes sense. It's always better to build safety into the system rather than relying on people to remember to do the right thing every time.
And then there's the Swiss cheese model, which is a great way to visualize why multiple layers of control are so important.
I like that analogy. It's very vivid.
Each slice of cheese represents a different control, and the holes represent the weaknesses in that control.
And a negative outcome, like an accident or a security breach, only happens when the holes in all the slices line up.
Exactly. You need multiple layers of defense because no single control is perfect.
And the example of the COVID-19 vaccine really illustrated this, right?
It did. You had proactive measures like the vaccine itself, trying to build immunity before exposure.
And then reactive measures like mask wearing and social distancing to limit the spread after exposure.
And the source also gave those interesting examples of organizations hiring ethical hackers or even former thieves.
To find the weaknesses in their systems before someone with bad intentions can exploit them.
Proactively looking for those holes in the cheese.
It's a really powerful concept. Now, the source was also very clear about the difference between controls existing and controls being applied effectively.
That's crucial. Just having a control on paper doesn't mean it's actually doing its job.
And the lateral flow test example during COVID really brought that home.
Yeah, just because tests are available doesn't mean they're being used properly or that people are acting on the results.
You have to think about the whole process. Are the tests easy to get? Are people reporting their results? Is there follow-up for those who test positive?
If any part of that chain is weak, the control isn't effective. And we also have to remember that even well-designed controls can fail if the situation changes unexpectedly.
Or if our assumptions were wrong in the first place.
And our risk responses can sometimes have unintended consequences.
You try to solve one problem, and you create another one somewhere else.
That's why things like risk assurance and internal audits are so important. They provide an independent check on whether our controls are actually working as intended.
Okay, so we've established our controls, we're checking that they're effective. How do we make sure this isn't just a one-time exercise?
That's where monitoring and reviewing come in. They're essential for ongoing risk management.
So what's the difference between monitoring and reviewing?
Monitoring is continuous. It's about keeping a constant watch on things. Reviewing is more periodic. It's a more formal evaluation.
Okay, so monitoring is the day-to-day checkup. Reviewing is the more in-depth examination.
Exactly. ISO 31000 stresses that both are essential for ensuring the quality and effectiveness of our risk management efforts.
So when we're monitoring, what are we looking for? What questions should we be asking ourselves?
You want to be constantly asking, what's happening in our environment, both internally and externally? Are there any trends or changes that could affect our risks? What can we learn from recent events?
It's about staying alert, keeping your finger on the pulse.
And the source highlighted three main approaches to risk monitoring.
Okay, give me the rundown.
First, you have key risk indicators, KRIs. These are metrics that tell you whether your risk management activities are actually having the desired effect.
Are we moving the needle on our overall risk profile?
And then you have key control indicators, KCIs. These focus specifically on the performance of your controls.
Are our controls working as well as we thought they were?
And finally, you need to be regularly assessing the overall status of your identified risks.
Where is each risk in its life cycle? Are we actively managing it? Has it been mitigated? Has it become a problem?
So those are the three main approaches, KRIs, KCIs, and risk status monitoring.
Let's dig into those a bit more. What are KRIs exactly?
Well, they're like an early warning system. They help you see if your controls are actually keeping your risks within your risk appetite.
So they're telling you whether you're on track to meet the expectations set by the board.
And they can be financial or non-financial, quantitative or qualitative.
It depends on the specific risks you're facing and what's important to your organization.
There are also some generic KRIs that can be applied across different organizations, like staff turnover, for example.
That could be a sign of either a threat or an opportunity, depending on the reasons behind it.
Exactly. So KRIs give you that high-level view of your risk landscape. KCIs, on the other hand, are more granular.
They're about the specific controls you have in place.
They tell you whether those controls are operating as intended and whether they're becoming more or less effective over time.
So you might track things like the number of unauthorized transactions, the percentage of staff who have completed training, the frequency of disaster recovery tests.
It's about getting that detailed view of how your risk mitigation efforts are actually performing in practice.
And KCIs can often give you an earlier warning than something like an internal audit, right?
They can. They're more of a continuous monitoring tool.
Okay, so KRIs and KCIs, those are both important. What about leading and lagging indicators? Where do they fit in?
All of these, KPIs, KRIs, KCIs, they can all be classified as either leading or lagging.
Okay, remind me what the difference is again?
Leading indicators give you insights into future trends, things that might happen down the line.
So they're forward-looking.
Lagging indicators tell you about what's already happened. They're historical data.
So KRIs tend to be more leading, KCIs more lagging.
But both are important for understanding how your risks are changing over time.
And the source also talked about different types of data we can use for monitoring.
Yes, ideally you want to be using all the data available to you.
Internal, external, data generated by people, data generated by machines.
The more information you have, the better your understanding of your risks.
And they specifically mentioned the Internet of Things and big data.
Those are becoming increasingly important as sources of risk information.
The IoT is all about collecting data from connected devices, right?
And big data is about the sheer volume, variety, and velocity of data.
It's a lot to handle, but it has the potential to give you a much more dynamic and real-time view of your risks.
Exactly.
And finally, there's risk status monitoring. What does that involve?
It's about tracking where each risk is in its life cycle.
So you might have a newly identified risk that's still being assessed, an active risk that's being managed, a mitigated risk that's being monitored.
You might also have risks that have been closed, either because they were successfully prevented or because they happened and were dealt with.
It's about having that clear overview of the state of all your identified risks.
So you can prioritize your efforts and focus on the ones that need the most attention.
Okay, so that's monitoring. Now let's talk about reviewing. How does that differ from monitoring?
Reviewing is more formal, more structured. It's a deeper dive into how well your controls are working and how effective your whole risk management framework is.
It's a step back to look at the bigger picture.
And it usually happens on a set schedule, like annually.
Although it can also be triggered by significant events or changes.
Like if a major incident occurs, or if you're planning to make big changes to your controls.
And the focus is on actual application of controls, not just whether they exist on paper.
Absolutely. You want to see how things are working in the real world.
And these reviews can take different forms. Self-assessments, evaluations by internal experts, independent audits.
The key is to get a clear and objective picture of how well your risk management is performing.
And of course, there's the annual board review, which is often a regulatory requirement.
Right, the board needs to have that oversight of the organization's risk management.
And the whole point of reviewing is to drive continuous improvement.
You learn from what's working well and what's not working so well, and you make adjustments.
And our sources recommend a regular review of the entire risk management framework, often on a 3-year cycle.
It gives you enough time to implement changes and see their effects before the next review.
And these framework reviews are often done by external experts, right?
They are. That provides an independent perspective and helps to benchmark your practices against industry standards.
So they'll come in, analyze your documentation, interview your staff, maybe even conduct surveys.
And then they'll provide you with a report outlining their findings and recommendations.
It's a valuable exercise for any organization that's serious about risk management.
And a crucial part of this whole review process is learning from experience.
Both the successes and the failures.
When you first implement a control, you have assumptions about how well it will work. But monitoring and reviewing give you real-world data.
So you can refine those controls over time, make sure they're achieving their intended purpose.
And during reviews, you should be asking some key questions.
Fire away. What are they?
Is this control still the right one for this risk? Is it working effectively? Is it good value for money?
And that learning shouldn't be limited to individual controls, right?
Look, it needs to apply to the whole risk management framework. How well are you identifying risks, analyzing them, connecting them to your objectives?
Are you adapting to changes in your internal and external environment? Are you sharing best practices across the organization?
It's about continuous improvement on a holistic level.
And our sources were particularly keen on the idea of learning from near misses.
Near misses are gold dust.
They're events that could have been really bad but weren't.
They give you a chance to understand why something didn't go as badly as it could have.
Did your controls work as expected? Was the risk properly identified in the first place?
By studying near misses, you can learn a lot about your risk management capabilities.
And the source gave some really good examples. A small fire that's quickly contained, a minor fraud attempt that's detected early.
An aircraft having a technical issue but landing safely. A competitor experiencing a disaster that you narrowly avoid.
Even a global pandemic.
These are all opportunities to learn and improve.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the technical aspects of risk management, but our sources also highlighted the importance of communication and consultation.
Those are absolutely crucial.
Add-ons, they are absolutely essential to making risk treatment work.
Absolutely. I mean, ISO Guide 73 from 2009, they define communication and consultation as these ongoing, iterative processes. It's all about sharing information and having a proper back and forth with stakeholders about managing risk.
It's that two-way street.
Yeah. And if you think about it, if you don't have good, open communication with everyone who has a stake in what your organization's doing,
Yeah.
how can you be sure that you have accurate information about the risks you're facing and about how well your controls are actually working?
It's a team effort.
It is. Risk management, it's a collaborative process. And communication, well, that's the language of that collaboration.
And it's not just about broadcasting information, is it? Because the definition specifically talks about dialogue. It emphasizes that back and forth.
Oh, yeah. That's a really key point. Consultation, as ISO Guide 73 emphasizes, it's a two-way street. It means getting input and feedback from your stakeholders before you make any decisions about how you're going to deal with risk.
Okay.
It's not necessarily about joint decision-making, but it's about making sure that everybody's perspective is taken into account.
Oh.
And that's where things like stakeholder mapping come in really handy.
Okay, how so?
Well, you identify who needs to be involved, like really deeply involved in the decision-making, who just needs regular updates, and who just needs to be informed.
You're mapping out your communication strategy.
Exactly. And all of this, it feeds directly into your communication plans.
Right. Now, speaking of communication plans, those sound like they should be a fundamental part of any organization's risk management efforts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of the key things that those plans should address?
Well, first off, according to an article in Forbes, a well-structured communication plan, it needs to have a clear line of accountability. Someone needs to be in charge of making sure the communication actually happens.
Someone has to own it.
Right. But then it all comes down to answering some pretty basic questions. Like, what's the point of this communication? What are we trying to achieve? Who are we trying to reach? What kind of message is going to work best for them? How are we going to deliver that message? When's the best time to do it? And of course, as we said, who's responsible? It's interesting, though, our source material points out that a lot of times organizations don't actually have these fully fleshed out communication plans.
Really?
Yeah. And if they do, they're often limited to just external communication.
Hmm.
Or they might only have plans for specific projects.
Right.
But the need for these plans, it goes way beyond that.
Yeah.
It cuts across all teams and departments. And risk information, it shouldn't be treated as this separate thing. It should be woven into the everyday communication that's already happening.
It should just be part of the fabric of the organization.
Exactly.
So we've talked about communication plans, but the material also mentions these reporting feedback loops.
Right.
How do those fit into the picture?
Well, this is where communication really starts to become a two-way street, a true dialogue. Think about it.
Yeah.
If you've got risk information constantly flowing upwards, reports going to management, to the board,
Yeah.
but there's no feedback coming back down. No one's saying whether they got the message, whether they understood it, whether they're actually doing anything about it.
Right.
People are going to get discouraged, right? It just turns into a one-way street, and the whole point of reporting gets lost.
You're just shouting into the void.
Exactly. So that's where these reporting feedback loops come in. It's about making sure that the people who provide that risk information, they know that it's been received. They know that it's been understood, and they know whether or not some action has been taken. And that table we talked about, the one outlining a communication plan with specific feedback mechanisms,
Right.
that's a great example of how to put this into practice. And ISO 31000, they reinforce this idea. They say that communication, it's about raising awareness. But consultation, that's about getting feedback to inform decision-making.
Mm.
So again, it's about ensuring that conversation about risk is a real two-way street.
It's a dialogue.
Exactly.
And that dialogue is really important when it comes to internal reporting as well, right?
Right.
What kind of risk information do directors and senior management need to have?
Well, if they're going to be effective at overseeing risk management, they need regular updates on the biggest risks the organization is facing, what controls are in place to manage those risks, and how well that whole risk management framework is actually working.
They need the full picture.
They do.
Hmm.
And while some regulations might only require an annual risk review, in practice, it's common for boards to receive risk management reports way more often, like at every board meeting.
Right.
And these reports, they're not just a formality, they're essential for making good decisions.
So it's about informing those decisions.
Yeah. So, once a risk has been identified and evaluated, the leaders need to decide whether to implement any controls, and if so, which ones. And here, the risk management team plays a crucial role. They provide these in-depth reports that lay out different control options, what they'll cost, and how they might impact the organization's operations.
They're giving the leaders the information they need to make a call.
Right. And at the end of the day, all of this reporting, it should lead to some real discussions about whether the organization is actually capable of managing its risks.
And whether they're still on track to achieve their goals.
Exactly. And sometimes those discussions, they might lead to decisions to invest in more risk mitigation measures or even to adjust those strategic goals.
They might need to change course.
Right.
So what exactly should be in these internal risk reports? I mean, is it enough to just hand over a list of all the risks that have been identified?
No, not really. If you just give them risk register or like a top 10 risk matrix, you're probably missing the mark. It can be overwhelming for the leaders.
Too much information.
Right. Or it could oversimplify things by just focusing on the highest ranked risks.
You're only seeing the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. So what you need are reports that give a clear picture of how confident the organization is about achieving its goals.
Okay.
They should highlight any big changes in the risks, the controls, the external environment, even the objectives themselves.
Keep everyone in the loop.
Right. They should flag any new risks that are emerging, point out any patterns or trends.
The big picture stuff, yeah.
And they should show how much progress is being made on reducing those risks. And crucially, they should spell out what still needs to be done. And of course, give updates on how effective those controls are proving to be. This kind of data, it gives senior management and the board the power to make informed decisions.
They can see what needs to happen.
Right. And they can approve any improvements that need to be made. And they can conduct that annual review, that big check-in, to make sure that everything is still aligned with the overall risk strategy and the risk appetite.
So they're staying on course.
Exactly. And while the risk register, it's the foundation for all this reporting, there are other tools that can be really useful too, like key risk indicators, those are your KRIs, and key control indicators, your KCIs.
Okay.
These can give some early warnings and some deeper insights into specific areas.
So it's about having the right information, but also presenting it in a way that's actually useful for decision making.
Absolutely.
Now, switching gears a little bit, let's talk about external reporting. Who outside of the organization needs to know about these risks?
So external reporting, that's particularly important for organizations that are regulated, like banks and insurance companies. They have these legal obligations to report certain things to their regulators.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, things like their risk management strategies, any
Mhm.
violations of regulations, data on customer complaints, things like that.
Okay.
But even beyond those heavily regulated sectors, there are often requirements to report on risks externally. For example, in the UK, the Companies Act 2006, it requires most companies to include a discussion of their principal risks and uncertainties in their annual reports.
So they've got to be transparent.
Exactly. It's about letting stakeholders know what challenges the company might be facing.
Okay.
And then there's the Financial Reporting Council, the FRC in the UK. They provide more guidance on this, what companies should be disclosing.
Sure.
Well, they expect companies to disclose things like their main risks, how confident the directors are in the company's ability to keep going, how they're applying that going concern principle, and an assessment of their risk management and internal control systems.
It's about giving a clear picture of the company's risk profile.
It is. And the FRC is clear that this isn't just about ticking boxes. It's about keeping stakeholders informed, making sure there's accountability, and ensuring proper oversight. They even have this financial reporting lab, and they've published some detailed guidance on what investors want to see when it comes to risk reporting.
Oh, interesting.
Like, how are the risks being managed? What's the nature of those risks? How is management responding to them? And are they using things like scenario analysis and stress testing?
So they're really digging deep.
Yeah. And you know what? It's not just companies under the FRC's watch. Even organizations that aren't directly regulated by them, like charities in the UK, they're often required by their own regulators, like the Charities Commission, to include a risk management statement in their annual reports.
It's becoming standard practice.
It seems to be.
Yeah.
And then there's the UK government. They have this really useful guide called Good Practice Guide Risk Reporting 2021. It outlines different types of risk reports that organizations can use.
Okay.
And they even have an example from Severn Trent Water's 2021 annual report.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier. What does that example show us about how this external risk reporting works in the real world?
So Severn Trent's report, it's a really good example of how companies actually communicate their key risks to their stakeholders.
Okay.
So they list out all these different risks. They've got health and safety, water quality, wastewater treatment processes, supply chain problems, cyber attacks, changes in regulations, pension funding, financial liquidity, climate change, environmental stuff.
That's quite a list.
It is, right? And then they go on to talk about emerging risks like rising energy costs, geopolitical instability, more supply chain disruptions, changing customer expectations.
So they're covering all the bases.
Yeah, they are. And the important thing here is that they say explicitly that having accurate and complete information is crucial for both understanding and managing these risks. So they're directly connecting transparent reporting to good risk management.
So it's about being open about the challenges they're facing.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about identifying risks, analyzing them, treating them, communicating and reporting on them.
Right.
How does all of this come together when it comes to making decisions within an organization?
So that feedback loop that we discussed earlier,
Right.
that's the key to all of this. The real point of risk management, it's not just to identify a bunch of risks and then write reports about them. It's about using that information to make better decisions.
Decisions that take those risks into account.
Exactly. And the big question that any good risk management process should be trying to answer is, given where we are now, the risks we're facing, both the threats and the opportunities and how we're managing those risks, are we on track to achieve what we set out to do?
Are we going to meet our goals?
Exactly. And the decisions that come out of that process, decisions that are made with a clear understanding of those risks, those are a key outcome of a mature risk management function.
It's about making smart choices.
It is.
Now, the material we're looking at, it actually outlines this 6-step decision-making process.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that a little bit? And how does risk management play into each step?
Sure. So this model, it's presented as a way to deal with threats, essentially a structured approach to solving problems.
Okay.
So the first step is to classify the problem. Is it a brand new situation, something you've never seen before? Or is it a recurring issue? The second step is to really clearly define the problem. What exactly are we dealing with? The third step is to specify what you want to achieve. What's the outcome we're looking for? What are the boundaries we need to work within? The fourth step is to choose the right way to address the problem, to meet those boundaries. And it's important to choose the right solution, not just the easiest one or the one that'll just get you by.
Make the tough calls.
Right. The fifth step is to take that decision and turn it into action. Break it down into steps and make sure everyone involved knows what they need to do. And then finally, the sixth step is to test it. Once it's been implemented, how's it working? Is it effective? Is it appropriate?
So it's about constantly evaluating and adjusting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And risk management should be a part of every single one of those steps, whether you're dealing with potential downsides or looking to capitalize on opportunities.
It's about weaving risk considerations into the entire decision-making process.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting? The material even raises this question about whether we always need to use the label risk-based decision-making.
Ah, okay.
The suggestion is that in a really mature organization, considering risk should be so ingrained, so automatic, that it's just a natural part of making any decision.
It's just how they do things.
Right. But even so, explicitly focusing on the need to consider risks can be a really powerful tool for organizations that are still developing their risk management capabilities.
It helps to make it front and center.
Yeah.
So last but not least, we need to talk about the people involved. It's not all about data and processes, is it?
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's people who make decisions.
Mm.
And all those human factors, perceptions, past experiences, what they know, their biases,
Right.
all of that plays a role in the choices they make. So it's crucial to be super clear about who's responsible for making what kinds of decisions,
Okay.
whether it's about how resources are allocated or whether strategic objectives need to be tweaked. And a lot of times, big decisions, they need to be escalated to the right level of authority within the organization. And, there was this fascinating article in the Harvard Business Review.
Yeah.
It highlighted that even when organizations have a ton of data at their fingertips, they don't always use it effectively.
Really?
Yeah. A lot of people, they tend to rely more on their gut feeling,
They go with their intuition.
or they just blindly accept the data without really questioning it, instead of taking a more balanced, critically skeptical approach.
So they're not really thinking critically about the information they're getting.
Right. And then on top of all that, you've got different decision-making styles. Some people are directive, some are analytical, some are conceptual, some are more
Little
behavioral.
mix of approaches.
Yeah. And all of this, it's influenced by whether someone is more focused on tasks or on people,
Yep.
and how much uncertainty they're comfortable with. And of course, an organization's risk culture and their risk appetite, those play a big role in shaping the decision-making process too.
It all ties together.
It does. So understanding all of this, those different styles, those human factors, it's vital if you want to make sure decisions are informed, that they take different perspectives into account, and that they're handled with sensitivity.
So you're creating an environment where good decisions can be made.
It just
This has been a really great deep dive. We've covered a ton of ground, from the basic definition of risk treatment all the way through to the different framework perspectives, the importance of prioritization, those feedback loops, communication, reporting, and even how all of this fits in with the human side of decision making. I think it's safe to say that you've got a much clearer picture now of how organizations approach this crucial aspect of risk management.
I hope so. And I think the big takeaway is that risk treatment, it's not just a static checklist that you tick off.
Right.
It's a dynamic, constantly evolving process that requires you to really think about the context, the goals, the stakeholders, and of course, the people who are making those decisions.
So to wrap things up, here's a final thought for you to chew on. Taking into account all those different decision-making styles that we've been talking about, how could an organization structure its communication about risk? To make sure that the really important information actually gets through to everyone. And I mean everyone, all the key stakeholders.
Right.
How can they make sure that communication leads to better, more informed decisions across the entire organization? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.